This week, the lectionary, which has the Bible passages for the week, served up two passages that are just so significant that I felt I had to speak on both. I didn't think I could pass on either one of them. So you'll have to hold in your memory that passage from the New Testament that Sheldon just read. In a minute, I'm going to read a passage from the Old Testament that has to do with the life of Joseph. It is a great lesson about the providence of God and that he can bring good out of any kind of bad. Let me introduce the idea of providence and Joseph. The Westminster Confession says this about providence. God, the creator of all, upholds, directs, and governs all creatures' actions and things. All things means stars, planets, asteroids, nations, people, birds, the hairs on our heads. Another way of saying this is everything that happens, God directs or allows, even though it is hard to see that when we're going through hard times, and even though it seems to conflict with the idea that we have free will, which is also true. So this is why God gave us his word, so that we can read about other people's experience and understand these things. And in particular, Joseph's life shows us about providence. His life is as interesting as any in the entire Bible. He had a roller coaster experience. He was one of the patriarchs of ancient Israel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph. In fact, he was Jacob's son. His brothers would be the people that headed the various tribes of Israel. But Joseph and his youngest brother had a different mom than the other brothers in that family, and they were quite a bit younger, and that made their father favor them over the other two. And as you know, that never works well in a family. We're told earlier, when his brothers saw that his father loved them more than all the brothers, they hated him. Joseph did not help the situation like a lot of us. He was cocky as a young man, full of himself. He had a dream. In that dream, both his father and his brothers bowed down to him. And then he went off and told them about that dream. That's not the way to win friends. Eventually, when the brothers were away from the father with Joseph, they attacked him, threw him in a pit, were going to kill him, but then they decided that they would sell him into Egypt. That happened in chapter 37. Several years later, when Joseph got to Egypt, he was sold to a man by the name of Potiphar. And because he was exceptional and God was with him, he rose to the top of Potiphar's household. Potiphar put him in charge of everything. And so he had been at the bottom when he arrived in Egypt, but now he had a position of power and some wealth. But trouble soon popped up. Potiphar had a wife who was a little bit slutty, and she tried to seduce him, and he knew that that was wrong, and he resisted. But out of resentment and anger, she went to her husband and said, "This man tried to attack me," and Potiphar put Joseph back in prison. There's a lot more to that story. Most of the last 13 chapters of Genesis have to do with Joseph. You won't be disappointed if you read those chapters. But what matters most in his life story and what ties into this idea of providence is a phrase that's repeated whenever something bad happened to Joseph. We read it again and again. 3 times we read it in chapters 39 and 40. The words are, "The Lord was with Joseph." But the Lord was with Joseph. Sold to slave traders? No problem. The Lord is with Joseph. Falsely accused, thrown in prison? Got it. The Lord is with Joseph. And of course, he is with us. When things go wrong, he will make them right, as Pam and the Grasses just sang. Pam and the Grasses. So let's read this passage, which picks up the story at the point at which, well, let me tell you a little more about Joseph's life. while he's in prison, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has a dream. And there's no one that can interpret it. Someone tells Pharaoh there's this Jewish fellow who's in prison who is really good at interpreting dreams. And so Pharaoh has him brought to him, and he tells him the dreams. There were two, actually. In the first one, he saw 7 healthy cows, but they were sort of devoured by 7 very sickly cows. And in the second dream, he saw 7 full, healthy grains of wheat, which were then eliminated by 7 dry, blighted stalks of wheat. And so Joseph tells Pharaoh, they are one dream. There are going to be 7 good years of healthy cows and lots of grain, and then there are going to be 7 bad years of drought and famine. And the bad years are going to be worse than the good years. Pharaoh says, what should I do? And Joseph, having the wisdom of God, says, stockpile food, and then when the famine comes, you'll have enough and you'll be able to sell it to the nations around you. And out of gratitude, Pharaoh puts him in charge of the rest of the country. Imagine a Jewish migrant put in charge of Egypt, number 2, just behind Pharaoh. So it's at this point in the story that the famine has affected Israel. For some reason, God did not share that vision of the famine with his own people. He shared it with Egypt. But again, he's the one who's in control. So Joseph now has this high position. The brothers in Israel are starving. Their father says, get yourselves down to Egypt, buy some grain from this man. And so who should show up in Pharaoh's or Joseph's court but these same brothers who had sold him into slavery 22 years earlier? So to identify himself to them, he had changed physically in those 22 years. He says to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. And when they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Now, he was just trying to let them know, who else would know that except me? I must be your brother, even though I don't look like you. But of course, when they heard that, they must have freaked out. He's going to kill us out of vengeance. But then he says to them, don't be disturbed. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. What a remarkable response. Don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now, there's been a famine in the land, and for the next 5, there will be no plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you, but God who sent me here. He made me a father or lord in Pharaoh's house, ruler of all Egypt. So now, hurry back to my father who had stayed behind in Israel, as had the younger brother Benjamin, and say to him, this is what your son Joseph said. God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You can live in this region of Goshen. It was a nice piece of land, kind of separate from Egypt, so that the Jews could keep their own religion and faith. And be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you here. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And afterwards, his brothers talked to them. Now, it's so interesting or ironic that the same dream Joseph had, that his brothers were going to bow down to him, that's exactly what happened all those years later. When they knew that Joseph was in charge, they bowed down to him and begged him for food. And again, when they realized it was him, they must have freaked out in fear. Imagine yourself. Put yourself in the story. You're mistreated, sold into slavery, separated from your family for 20 years. Could you forgive the people who did that to you? How was that possible? Joseph had come to understand this idea of God's providence. Horrible things happened to him, but the Lord was with him throughout, and those things were part of God's good plan. It was God who had allowed them all to happen in order to save lives during that famine. Now, we don't have time to get into all of this, but God was also preserving the Messiah. Remember, the promise to Abraham was God was going to bless the whole world. That was the salvation that was going to come to us through Jesus. That had not happened yet. The Jews had to be protected. They were starving in Israel, and so God sets things up that allows them to go there, and their line was able to keep going. We see the same thing again and again in the Bible. Babylonians tried to exterminate the Jewish people. So did the Romans. Those empires are dead and gone. The people of God still lived on. That's the meaning of verse 7, where Joseph says, God also sent me here to preserve a remnant. Anyway, getting back to providence, what the brothers did to Joseph, that was only a secondary cause in what happened to him. When Potiphar's wife did this horrible thing to him, that was only a secondary cause. It was God who was behind it all, planning it, working people and events together to bring a good result in the end. And Joseph was able to see that, and that's why he's able to forgive his brothers. Now, as we always say, all these Old Testament events, they point to Jesus in some way. So where is he in this? His betrayal and death are part of this same pattern. Like Joseph, he was sold for money and then crucified by people with an evil intent, and yet God providentially brought good from that. So in the same way, when things go bad for us, we can have confidence in God, whatever comes our way. We can trust God's plan is loving because he sent Jesus. He who sent his own son, will he not give us everything else? Now, that doesn't mean bad things won't happen. They absolutely will happen, but God will work those things out. It also does not mean we won't die. We will die. We are all going to die. I've been surrounded by death in the last several days. But that's the hope that we have. Now, let's move on to the passage that Sheldon read earlier. Since we are going to die, we want to know what's going to happen after we die. That's been a fear or a concern for every person who has ever been on the earth. And 1 Corinthians 15 is the single chapter in the whole Bible that explains the resurrection. 2 weeks ago, we read another portion of this chapter, which addressed the question of why should we believe the resurrection really happened? Paul said, well, because 500 people saw Jesus after he was brought back to life. That's eyewitness testimony. A lot of them are still alive. You can ask them about it. Now he addresses the question of what will our bodies look like when we are resurrected? And this is, someone will ask, how are the dead raised? What kind of body do they come forward with? It's a very natural question. What kind of bodies will we have? Now, again, this is when Christ returns to set up the new heaven and the new earth. I was in my 50s before I realized the Bible's teaching was when we get to heaven, we're going to have new supernatural heavenly bodies like Jesus had after he was resurrected. I thought we were just going to be spirits. After we die here, before Jesus returns, we are just going to be spirits, and I can't say too much about that. We will be with God. Nothing bad can happen to us, but we will not have these new bodies that he had. And Paul's been talking about the fact there's going to be resurrected bodies, so what do they look like? And to explain the whole thing, Paul uses an analogy they know about, seeds and plants. The seed that goes in the ground has to die in order for the plant to be produced. It's the same with our old bodies and the new ones that we're going to have. A seed is really the same thing as the plant that grows from it, right? In one sense, it's got the same DNA. Everything that that plant is going to be, even though it looks very different, is already in the seed. And so when a farmer puts that seed in the ground, we don't really know what it's going to look like when it comes out. You could never look at a tomato seed and think, oh yeah, I see a tomato plant. God does it in his own way. Again, they're the same, and yet they're very different. So our bodies, before we're resurrected, they're our bodies. After we're resurrected, they're still our bodies. I'm going to be me. You're going to be you. You're going to be, yeah, you, that's right. And that's his point. The seed and the plant are an analogy to our old bodies and our new bodies. We can't really conceive of how great our bodies are going to be, in the same way that a corn stalk is so much greater than a little kernel of corn. But there are definitely things that we can say about these new bodies. How will they be different than the older bodies? Well, the new bodies will be imperishable. That means they will never decay. Right now, we're stuck with bodies that do decay. Our future that God has planned out for us is that we're going to live in heaven. And there's no death, no sin in heaven, and so there'll be no decaying of our bodies. And so we're going to need imperishable bodies up there. Then he goes on to say they're weak when they go in the ground. Actually, they're less than that. They're powerless. They're lifeless. But our new bodies will be powerful. We don't know exactly how. Jesus' resurrected body was able to do amazing things. But our bodies will be powerful and they will be imperishable. Our current bodies, they work okay here. But again, we're headed for a heavenly existence in the new heaven and earth. And so we're going to need new bodies there which are made for that supernatural existence. And then he goes into this thing about Adam and Jesus. Adam was the man of dust. God made him from dust. The natural body came first, and then God breathed into him the spirit of life. We, as humans, we've inherited from Adam, who sinned and rebelled against God, all of the negative characteristics of these human bodies. They decay, they're prone to sin, etc., etc. But Jesus was the second Adam. He was the life-giving spirit. And if we are in Christ, if we are his, if we've trusted him as Lord and Savior, then everything that he has, we will one day inherit as well. So we inherit from Adam, and now we're going to inherit from Jesus. We can't go into as much detail. Each one of these texts really deserves several sermons, but I didn't know with the lectionary if we would get to them again in the next few years, and that's why I figured we better do that. So here's the promise I want to send you off with. The final verse says, just as we have borne the image of the earthly man, meaning all that decay and sin, so one day we will bear the image of the heavenly man. That's the promise of God. Philippians 3 says the same thing. He will transform this lowly body of ours so they are like Jesus' glorious body. The whole thing comes down to belief in the resurrection. If Jesus really rose again, then we can rise again too.